Hey everybody, welcome to Help Me Understand, a podcast where we are seeking clarity through biblical conversation. Today is episode 9. We are 9 episodes in, and so thanks for following along with us as we've spent some time talking through what are hopefully some helpful issues. And today we want to do what will be part 1 of a 2-part conversation talking about the end of the world as we know it and why you should feel fine, to borrow a musical line. But
we're trying to reduce everything to like a 3-word question.
That's
for
right.
For our title. So
end
fit that one in.
times. Yes, end times.
Nick.
All right. Yeah, that's right, Nick. Thanks for setting up our equipment and following along and recording us today. But yeah, so the end times, the millennium views, kick us off here.
Well, so really we could call this a 3-part series. So what we want to do is talk for 2 parts and answer questions for a 3rd part. So we're going to do part 1 and part 2 wearing these clothes today. We're not trying to fool you into thinking that we're doing this over time. We're going to do 2 episodes today, press pause, and then start talking again. What we want to do is ask you, please to send questions. It feels like these issues are rising more into the forefront of all of our thoughts and kind of spiritual lives these days. In a world of chaos, oftentimes, I think we've sort of been preconditioned to start to think about the end of the world. That might be just a cultural thing. I think it's definitely a church thing where there's so much confusion surrounding these subjects that anytime things get thrown up in the air, we're like, oh yeah, that's good. That's supposed to ring a bell for me to start thinking about.
I think it's helpful.
The world.
It's helpful because it's not just a cultural phenomenon where they're like, okay, well, the world is going to end. You know, another comet is going to come and wipe us out like the dinosaurs, or the sun is going to overheat and we're just going to be burnt up. But in fact, there is some biblical category for how things shall end.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should live with it in view.
Yeah.
We should definitely have it in all throughout Scripture, told to stay awake, stay alert, stay aware of these things.
So a good place to start is talking about what will be that ending moment, and then what will follow. And so what we would call the 1,000-year period is a millennium. That's an actual period of time. So you have decades, 10 years, centuries, 100 years. And then a millennium would be 1,000. And so talking about what our millennial view is then, okay, there is a 1,000-year long time span mentioned in Revelation chapter 20. And so if Jesus returns in relationship to this 1,000-year time span, we get some terms that we're going to define about how we view that 1,000-year time span. So you hear something that's like millennialism, and we're not talking about like a group of people who were born around the dawn of the new millennium, like an age or culture, right? So it's not millennials in terms of it's their fault for everything going wrong. Or even like,
millennial.
Yeah, exactly. So when we're talking about that, we're referring to that 1,000-year time of peace, perhaps, depending on your view. But so
if someone said to me, where do you start in thinking about the end times, it would be to start in this passage of Scripture and consider what you believe about this 1,000-year time span. So let's just read the passage. I'll read Revelation 20. We'll go down to verse 6, starting verse 1. John says, "And I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key to the abyss and a great chain in his hand. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He drew him into the abyss, closed it, and put a seal on it, so that he would no longer deceive the nations until the 1,000 years were completed. After that, he must be released for a short time." Verse 4 says, "Then I saw thrones and people seated on them who were given authority to judge. I also saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony about Jesus and because of the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and who had not accepted the mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. Verse 6 says, Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. So then what goes on after these 6 verses is we see this scene of a battle. So really, in this passage of Scripture, so many of the images that we're used to thinking about in relationship to kind of apocalyptic literature, and specifically the book of Revelation, seen. It kind of all pulls together here in this one passage. And where you land on what the passage means usually categorizes people into one of 3 categories.
Yeah, and we're not giving a one is better than the other today.
We're just saying
we're
going to say which one we believe.
Perhaps.
Right?
Yes,
yeah.
perhaps.
So, all right. So I'm just pointing out a few books here. These books are present in around lots of different issues. This is a 3 views book. So 3 views on the millennium and beyond. Spells out a view of premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism, which we'll talk about what those 3 terms mean in just a second. But these are great. So what will happen in these books, someone will present a position, and then the other guys who are going to argue for the other positions will counter the argument of the one. So it requires some thinking, but you get the opportunity to compare and contrast. I don't even want to talk about that one necessarily. Perspectives on Israel and the church. So this is 4 views, same kind of idea. 4 views on how God relates to Israel. What about the nation of Israel? The Old Testament, New Testament, into the future. And then I'll show my hand, and this one is my favorite. So this is a book called Kingdom Come, which is a large book, like a 700-page book, by a pastor and author named Sam Storms. And so that one's mine. I'm there. I'm
Front and center.
In the amillennial camp. We'll put that as the foundation at the bottom right here.
So
Stack
good.
these up neatly
Sam is your
right
guy.
on top of it.
I love that.
And I think how's that? Does that look okay?
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, as long as put the dispensational book off the table.
Yeah, I didn't even bring the
all right.
dispensational book.
So anyway, so let's start. Let's walk through. The first one we'll talk about is premillennialism. So
Okay, so let's say this before we go. Sorry.
Okay.
Pre, post, as in before, after,
during.
Well, yes, or no. We would argue no. So it can mean no millennium. Is in relation to when Jesus returns, what happens next? Where do the 1,000 years fit? Mm-hmm. Right. So that's what the pre and post is in relation to the return of Christ. Is Christ going to return before the millennium, after the millennium, or should we be thinking about it altogether differently? Okay?
Right.
So go ahead.
Okay, so let's start.
Premillennialism.
Premillennialism. Lots of L's today.
To say.
Yes. So pre meaning before. Jesus will return before the 1,000 years begins. There's 2 really important distinctions to this pre-mill, which we're going to use as our abbreviation from now on. Pre-mill. Distinction number 1 is historic pre-mill.
2 camps underneath.
2 huge, yeah, absolutely. So historic pre-mill, you have that Jesus begins his kingdom after the ascension of Christ with the work of the apostles. And so this is the church age. So you see some markers, I think, steady decline in history. So as the church age comes to an end, things get worse.
So Jesus lives, dies, rises from the dead. The church age begins.
Right. So we would say, or someone who is pre-mill would say, like myself, would say that the church age then began with the work of the apostles in the book of Acts.
Okay.
And
Things are getting worse. That's why we got all this language around,
right,
like decline, and why we think so much about when things get hard. Like
right.
That's obviously, this is progressing toward the return of Christ.
So then you have, after this church age, great tribulation will begin. So this marks the beginning of last days. And so the tribulation meaning that believers suffer greatly at the hand of or due to like an antichrist figure, and that unbelief then begins to like reign on the earth. And so you have things get bad and then they get worse.
Things slide toward a really intense period of tribulation.
Right. Yeah.
That's the term we.
But then after the tribulation, so there's this period ends. Jesus then returns and raptures or takes his church, calls his church to rise, and rewards those who are righteous, those who are in him are rewarded. Then he descends to earth, so he comes to earth, the church rises, that's the ascension. Then there's the descension back to earth. There's the final battles, the defeat of Satan, the binding for 1,000 years, and then Jesus then sets up his new heaven on earth.
Yeah, well, you got your 1,000 years after the battle.
Yeah.
You got your millennium at that point.
Right.
Then at the end of the millennium, a new heaven and a new earth, which you would see then in Revelation 21.
Right. So,
Okay.
Yeah, so that'd be the first.
Okay, still working off the same kind of structure is what is known as dispensationalism or dispensational premillennialism, which is a mouthful.
Yes. You talk about a mouthful.
see.
Wait till you hear what they believe.
All right. So this is the view. So underneath the heading of premillennialism, this is the view that dominates the landscape today
Why is that? Why is this so popular?
because of the Left Behind books. That's why.
Thank you. Shout out to Tim LaHaye, wherever you are, and Jerry Jenkins.
Yeah, I think it was Jerry Jenkins.
Man,
Yeah.
we miss you guys. I don't know where you are.
Yeah.
Just probably enjoying the rewards of writing those
I think Tim LaHaye may have died.
19.
I'm sorry.
Oh, well.
He was old. I'm not sure. This is so disrespectful. He was a great man of God, I'm sure.
I'm sure he is. Anyway, good fiction books. Go ahead.
Yeah, so these books grew out of around like the 1920s with some leaders, some theologians. Charles Ryrie is one at the center of this.
Like the Ryrie Bible?
Yeah, so that's why, like, if you're in East Tennessee, everybody's grandfather had a Ryrie study Bible. And it was the notes from this professor from Dallas Theological Seminary who really is his ideas and many others as it gained ground started to really dominate the landscape. And so since the early 1900s, this has been the dominant view in our part of the world. And so this view just got got blasted all over. And then, when did the Left Behind books come out? The 90s?
Mid-90s.
Mid-90s.
Yep,
So
94, 95.
Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins come along and write this fictional story where people are living in the end times underneath this view. Mm-hmm. So the things we see in those books and movies, they all turn into movies as well, is a depiction of this dispensational premillennial view. Mass production, mass popularity, and it's known for two things. Okay, so one is a belief that the history of redemption and salvation, is separated into varying dispensations. So God deals with his people in different ways at different times. Then, second, there's a distinction made and emphasized between Israel and the church. So Israel is one distinct group of God's people, and the church has a different set of promises from God. So Israel and the church are distinct. So to the dispensationalists, the Old Testament prophecies about Israel will be fulfilled in the current Jewish political state of Israel. They believe the entire Old Testament sacrificial system is going to be reinstituted. A new temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem. And so much hinges on the nation of Israel. This is why you see this all over the place. This is why...
this is very pro-Israel.
Very pro-Israel.
They would see that the creation of the nation state of Israel as being one of those dispensations.
Yes. So
in the end times.
Yes. So in the dispensational view, Christ's kingdom is coming entirely in the future and after the church age. Whereas so in the historic premillennial view, Christ's kingdom began after the ascension. So that gives you a whole different set of lenses to read the scriptures by. Now, so the promises of God are distinct for Israel and the church underneath this view. And in this view also, major point is where we start to think about the rapture. So how is the rapture going to take place? In dispensational premillennialism, Jesus is going to return to earth to take with him his people, to rapture them, for them to rise, and they will miss the tribulation.
Right.
So we'll be rescued out, and that's when kind of all hell breaks loose.
Literally.
On earth,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
So,
and that tribulation is split into two periods. So you have like the first half of the tribulation being where the Antichrist is revealed, and the second half is when that Antichrist takes power, persecutes what's left of the church, assuming that there is a still possibility for the church to exist.
Yeah, so we have the whole question of how do people come to, who comes to Christ, and
Absolutely.
how many people come to Christ,
Absolutely.
and Gentiles, Jews, all those questions to be considered.
Ultimately, after that 7-year tribulation, Jesus returns, destroys the Antichrist, binds Satan, sets up his kingdom, reigns for 1,000 years. After that, Satan is released. There's an attack, but ultimately Jesus calls down judgment from heaven, destroys Satan, and the final judgment occurs.
Yeah. So if anyone's mind is blown yet, this is kind of the timeline.
Yes.
And this is where we get into the debate. So now some people want to talk about, do you believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, a mid-tribulation rapture at the 3.5-year point, which is all lifted out of different passages and goes back to the book of Daniel and some of those questions and how they relate to the book of Revelation? Or some people would say there is post-tribulation rapture at that point. So,
Right.
So that's kind of a really in-house debate underneath historic premillennialism.
Yeah.
And sometimes people will just ask a question like, where are you on the rapture? Assuming that, well, like everybody believes.
It's assumed that's an assumed pre-mill view.
Yeah, assumed dispensational premillennial view.
Okay, so that's the pre-millennial view. Now we'll talk about post. So idea this after the millennium, Jesus will return after the 1,000 years end. They don't see the coming of Christ, the second coming of Christ, as it were, as happening before. It happens after. So in regard, they think that this whole idea of a millennium, 1,000 years, is not a literal 1,000 years. That it's figurative, it's symbolic, and that Christ's kingdom began when he came to earth, and that now we are in the last days. And so Jesus has already established his kingdom. You go ahead. No, this is like this is something that this view has something in common with the amillennial view as well, where there's a covenantal view of redemptive history. So there's
super important here. The big distinction.
This is very, very big. There is a difference between those two views in that covenantal views of redemptive history means that the church, the New Testament church, is as important as the Old Testament nation of Israel, and so they are one and the same.
Yeah. So the language we would use is that the church is the fulfillment of Old Testament Israel. So from the very beginning, when God speaks, the gospel is spoken in Genesis 3:15. Then we see it unfold by Genesis 12 when God calls Abraham, who becomes the father of the nation of Israel, the people, father of God's people. He becomes known as the father of faith. So he foresees a day when Jesus comes, or God is telling him a day when Jesus comes, and God's people are those by faith. And in the Old Testament, they're saved by looking ahead to Christ. In the New Testament, we're saved by looking back to Christ. But God has one covenant people from beginning to end.
Right.
So in postmillennialism, there's that portion, which is super important. That's consistent with amillennialism. the distinction between the two revolves around the 1,000 years. So
Yeah.
postmillennials also believe that things are that the kingdom is advancing in this age now to like a positive end. So people are coming to faith in Jesus, culture's being renewed, things are getting better, and eventually Jesus enters in, and that scene comes back at that point, sets up a new heaven and new earth as the kingdom is ushered in through through the church.
Absolutely. So you could talk about this, things are getting worse or things are getting better as a way to just easily identify pre- and post-millennial views. It's important to say the better and worseness is connected to the gospelization, the Great Commission either failing or succeeding, not necessarily life getting better or worse, or prosperity coming or going. It has more to do with, will the world be Christianized? I love that term that you wrote down. Will we succeed in Christianizing the world before Jesus comes back?
Right.
And the post would say, yes, we will.
Yeah.
All right, so let's turn to amillennialism. So there are different variations, different views in this. It's not amillennialism, it's and as in no.
So it's like amoral, like no morals.
It doesn't exist, or just that this period of 1,000 years. This is in contrast to the pre-millennial position in that they believe that Christ's kingdom began with the first coming of Christ. And so now, the times we're in, those are the last days, end times. And so super important underlying belief is this 1,000-year reign, this period spoken of in Revelation 20 that you read earlier. It's not a literal 1,000 years, but the time where Christ is ruling and reigning between his two times he comes to the earth. This first coming in his birth and his second coming in his redemption of the world. And so it's not necessarily a literal 1,000 years. It's more of here's a symbolic time period that we're living in between Christ's.
Yeah, so what I would say is the kind of the distinctive view here for me is that what we just read in Revelation 20 is a picture not of what's happening on earth, but John sees this picture of what's happening in heaven. Now, the Bible teaches that we have to always keep this in mind, we always forget this, but we know it's true. There is a heaven now, known theologically as the intermediate state, where Christians go after they leave this earth. But what's coming is a new heaven and a new earth, and that's where we'll live and rule and reign with Christ forever.
Right.
So what we have a picture of here in Revelation 20 is a picture of the intermediate state. What's happening now is Jesus is there. The martyrs, those who have been beheaded for Christ, who have refused to, in this imagery, have refused to follow the beast, to follow the Antichrist, they now are ruling and reigning and receiving reward for their faith and time on earth. And so this is just a picture of that. So it's possible it could be 1,000 years. It's possible it might not be 1,000 years. No one could, with a straight face, say that they are taking every image of symbolic language in the book of Revelation in a literal sense, in which they believe everything will like Jesus coming back with a sword out of his mouth, right? So no one believes that that's actually what's happening. We know the sword coming out of his mouth is a picture of his word. The Bible is referred to as the sword of the Spirit.
Right.
So we don't take every term in a literal, visible, tangible sense. So the 1,000 years, it could be 1,000 years, but there's so much symbolism around the number 1,000 anyway.
Yeah.
Throughout Scripture. So it's possible it could be 1,000 years. But what I see here is a picture of the intermediate state, a picture of heaven as it exists right now. it essentially eliminates the question of whether or not the 1,000 years is present on Earth, right? It says, okay, this is what we see here. And so I think just to kind of draw some parallels between them, between these three views, like you've got to determine, as we kind of tie it up here, like in relationship to the timeline, like that's really where all the debate is, right? All the debate is, and kind of goes back to this issue of what do you think is going to happen next?
Right.
Right. What do you think is going to happen next? Where are we? How should we live in light of that? Matters for many different reasons, right? Like, what kind of urgency are we living with? What do we think is going to, like, how prepared do we need to be for suffering?
Yeah.
How prepared do we need to be, like all those things begin to feed our faith where we actually live.
They do matter. And so I want us to be able to kind of hit pause on this conversation, and so call this part 1 of episode 9. And so hopefully it's been helpful for me. It's always helpful to sort of revisit this. It's not unimportant to make a decision about what you think the Bible is saying about really any issue, but specifically here. So next week, here's what I want to tease out a little bit. First being, I think we'll start next week talking about, or part 2, we'll start talking about, okay, here's where I land and maybe why. And then also all right, here's why landing here really matters. Here is how it changes, and some real practical implications of that. Again, we want to stress the importance of wanting to answer some questions. We know there's tons of things that come up surrounding this, and so you can send those to us at helpmeunderstand@arrowhead.church. HMU at arrowhead.church. So send those in via email, hmu@arrowhead.church. And we would love to do our best to sort of answer those questions, comments, helpful critiques.
3.
And then part 3 is when we'll do that. So there we go.
Subscribe, rate, review. Even only in part 1.
That's right. We'll see you next time.